In this video, we're going to have a look at soil. Try and understand the various characteristics of soils and the different types of soils that you can use. We're also going to look at soil amendments, and then I'll help you select the right soil for the style of gardening you've picked. Let's start making a garden and selecting some soil. Topsoil is the top few inches of soil. And if we take an area that's been left alone, so this is a wild area, it could be a meadow or it could be a forested area, but some place where we haven't had a lot of agriculture, the soil profile looks something like this. The top part is really nice and dark. And as we move down that profile, the soil gets lighter and lighter. And you might even get this yellow layer. Depends on where you're digging. The soil at the top, those top 2 or 3 inches, if you're lucky it's 6 inches, is called topsoil. That's where most of the plant roots exist. That's where most of the organic matter is in the soil. That's where plants want to grow, and that's the best soil you can have. Below that level, we start getting into something called subsoil. Has a lot less organic matter and is not nearly as good for growing plants. So here's the problem with most homes, particularly new homes. When those homes are built, the builder comes along and removes all that topsoil. In fact, it's a government requirement. They have to take the topsoil away before they start construction. And that topsoil has to be used in an environmentally friendly way. So this is actually a good thing. They then build the house with a lot of heavy equipment, a lot of digging, and what you're left with is a whole bunch of subsoil. Then they'll come back and they'll put 2 inches of topsoil back on your property, put down the lawn, and that's your home. Now you come along and your soil is pretty crappy because all you have is subsoil. The good stuff has all been taken away. And so this is a problem that gardeners have, and we have to do something to improve that soil over time. And we'll be talking about different ways to do that. But if you're going to go and buy some soil, topsoil is a good choice. Another good choice that's very popular is something called triple mix. Triple mix is supposed to be 1/3 soil, 1/3 peat moss, and 1/3 compost. Now, what is it in reality? I have no idea. I've asked a few places that sell triple mix what's really in it and do they have some testing done, and no, they don't. So they could put in whatever they want, but triple mix is usually pretty good soil. The reason is that 2/3 of it is organic matter. So the compost and the peat moss are both organic matter. The soil component is mostly the sand, silt, and clay. When you mix it together, 1/3 of each of these, you end up with a very fluffy soil that holds a lot of moisture. It has a lot of air, which plant roots need, and you end up with a really good soil. And the compost adds nutrients to this soil. So triple mix is actually a good soil to buy if you're trying to fill raised beds or even containers. The problem with triple mix is that 2/3 is organic. Now, I just said that's a good thing, and it is if you're trying to grow in it. But what happens to that organic matter over time? Well, it slowly decomposes. That peat moss and the compost slowly get less and less as it decomposes in the soil. So after a few years, it's 1/3 as thick as you started with. So if you put this material in raised beds, you'll have a great garden this year, and next year it'll have settled way down. The year after, it'll have settled even more. So each year you have to bring in more soil. So I tend to start any garden that I'm doing, if I do need soil, is I'd prefer to go get some topsoil because the amount of organic matter is much less. But to be honest, triple mix does grow some really great vegetables. So we have different types of soilless material that people use both in the garden and in raised beds and in containers. Compost, peat moss, coir, vermiculite, and perlite. So the top two you probably have some understanding about. Coir may be completely new to you. In the production of coconut, it comes with an outer husk. And after they process the coconut out, they're left with this waste product called coconut husk. They grind that down into a product called coir, and it has properties very similar to peat moss. Vermiculite and perlite are inorganic materials that are added to soil to make it lighter. Now, each of these products affects the soil a little differently, and most people really don't understand what the differences are. If you go online and ask, which combination is best, you'll get 100 different answers, and people will combine all of these things in various ratios without any real logic to the process. They just know all this stuff is good for plants. So let's try to understand what the differences are. First of all, let's look at peat moss and coir. So we got peat moss on the left and coir on the right. In this case, it's called cocoa bale, but it's coconut coir fibers. In the last few years, a lot of people have been writing about the fact that we shouldn't be using peat moss because we're taking our peat bogs and we're destroying them, and that's harming the environment. And to some extent, that's correct. There is some harm. The problem is we have more peat moss every year than we can possibly harvest. On a global basis, we harvest about 1% of the peat moss that grows naturally every year. And almost all that peat moss is used for heating, agriculture, and forestry. The amount that gardeners use is minuscule compared to those other things. Peat moss is not an environmental issue. We get a lot of it in Canada. We have a readily source for it. Now, cocoa husk sounds like a better product. I mean, it's the waste product of the coconut industry. They get these piles and piles of coconuts left over. You might as well use them for someone. And it sounds like such a great environmental choice until you look at this a little closer. And what you find, in fact, is that the factories that produce this stuff are horrendous places for people to work because they're extremely dusty. And this all takes place in India and Sri Lanka, where the regulations aren't that good for keeping the air quality. The other problem you have is that those coconuts have a lot of salt on them, and that has to be washed out before we can use them in horticulture. So they're using a lot of fresh water to clean the coir so they can package it up and put it on a ship to get it from India up to Canada or the US or Europe. So it really depends on where you live, I think. If you live in an area like North America where we have a good peat moss source, it's actually the better environmental choice. If you're in Europe, coir might be a better choice. Both of these products do about the same thing. They both hold moisture. Neither one adds very many nutrients. They make the soil fluffier. They add more air, and that's good for plants. If we compare the various options, there's really three criteria we should look at. The first one is, does it make the soil lighter? Does it add air? Plants need both air and water, and all of these products will do that. So on that basis, they're all a good choice. When we look at providing nutrients, compost is the only one that adds nutrients. Now, peat moss and coir, as they decompose, add very small amounts, but it's pretty much insignificant. So if you want a product to add to soil and you want to feed the plants, then compost is the one to get. The other thing that's important is the holding of nutrients. And this is something that's not well understood by a lot of gardeners. When we fertilize or when we put compost on our gardens, the nutrients that plants use are in a form that travel very easily with water. So every time it rains, the water washes nitrogen through the soil and away from plant roots. It's important that we put something in the soil to hold on to those nutrients. Now, clay does that. Sand and silt do not. So if your soil has a lot of clay, then that is a help for holding nutrients. The other three that do a good job of that is compost, peat moss, and coir. Vermiculite and perlite don't hold nutrients, so they're actually a really bad choice for putting into soil. I wouldn't put those in any kind of garden. I wouldn't put them into raised beds, and quite honestly, I wouldn't even put them into containers. Go with soil. Compost is your best choice. If you want to put in some peat moss or coir, those are also good. When we're looking at containers, most people will go out and buy soil for those plants. And that material is usually called potting soil. Certainly around here, most potting soil consists of mostly peat moss. And then they throw in a little perlite just to make it a little more interesting. But it's essentially a peat moss product. And for years, I've been using ProMix. There are other good products on the market, but I just have experience with this one. This is the industry standard. So if you go to most nurseries who are using a purchased product, they're going to be using ProMix. So that's a good choice. It's a little expensive for the garden though. It's great for containers. It's also great for a couple small raised beds, but if you need this in quantity, this is a really expensive way to go. Here's an interesting idea that I've seen on the internet. I've never actually tried this, but I'm sure it works fairly well. So you want a really simple solution and you just want to play around with a few vegetables and kind of get the hang of things? Go out and buy some potting mix, cut the top of the plastic off, and plant. That potting mix is great soil for growing vegetables. Now, the problem I see here is that you don't have a lot of soil. That depth is only a couple inches, and that's great for lettuce, which is what they're growing here. It's also good for radishes. It's good for any small type of vegetable. You can probably do a few beets in here. Carrots probably wouldn't work because they have this long taproot and it's not deep enough. And tomatoes and peppers probably don't work quite so well unless you only put like 1 or 2 plants in a bag. But this is a really simple way to get started if you just want to give it a try. You also have these raised beds, and I think raised beds are a good idea once you know that you really want to garden. If this really is your first garden, you've never gardened before, I would just garden in containers or in the ground. Learn a little about it. See if you even like it. You may hate gardening. So why go out and spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars building these things, filling them with soils, putting in some plants, then you find out you hate it and you don't want to garden. So I wouldn't start this way. Now, once you have some experience, you know what you're doing and you know you really like these and you really want them, go ahead and build yourself some. So now that you have a better understanding of the different types of soil and amendments, which one should you use for your garden? Well, this depends on the style you selected. If you're going to grow your vegetables in containers, then do one of 2 things. If you're only going to have a few containers, just go out and buy some potting soil. Get a few bags, bring it home, fill the pots, you're ready to go. Keep it simple. If you're going to use larger containers or a lot of containers, then you need more soil and buying it in bags is just too expensive. In that case, order a load of triple mix. Triple mix is a pretty good soil for growing vegetables, and it's a lot cheaper than bagged material. If you've decided to use raised beds, then I would use either triple mix or just order some topsoil. Triple mix is a much nicer soil and is very fluffy, but over the next couple years it's going to compact and degrade very quickly. You're going to have to keep adding more soil every year. So if it was me and I was using raised beds, I would get topsoil. That's real soil. And then every year I would just amend with some compost. If you're going to grow on the ground, you already have soil and you don't need to get more. But your soil is probably low on organic matter. So your goal is to keep adding that organic matter. And the 2 best choices, as you've seen, are compost and manure. Depending on the size of your garden, you can buy those products as bagged materials, or if you want to save some money, get a load delivered. Put that organic matter on your garden and dig it in. For most new gardens, what I would recommend is a good 4 to 6 inches of organic matter, and then dig that into the garden. To see the next video in this series, click in the top right-hand corner. That will take you to a playlist that contains all the videos in this series.